It's that time of the week where we dive into quite a few names that I had as fringe starts during my start and sit videos throughout the week. And we try to determine for those guys that are right on the fringe of being starts, do they have a better chance at finding their upside that week, or do they have a better chance at finding their floor? Who's gonna go nuclear and who's gonna be a landmine? Since I record these videos on Fridays, you know I'm already rocking my live stream outfit for 2025, brought to you by Chubbies this year. And you better believe I'll be rocking this shirt on Monday Night Football as well when Detroit welcomes Tampa Bay into the Motor City. But if you want to rock your favorite team and make sure that you're feeling comfortable yet smooth throughout the weekend, head on over to Chubbies as we help them launch their new NFL line. And right now for our viewers, you can get $10 off your entire order over at Chubbies when you use code HEADLINERS at checkout. So head on over to the website, use the link in the description down below, get yourself some awesome NFL swag, and let's jump into my first player for this week. Unfortunately, I'm not going to list him as a nuke or a landmine. Let's talk about Rashee Rice. Now, if you've been a part of this channel all season long, then you know when I do these nuke and landmine videos, I take the opportunity to talk a little bit more about players that had some concerns or had some question marks for me when I talked about them in the start sit video. This is an opportunity for me to be a little bit more in depth on each individual player. I was not anticipating the reaction I got when I gave my analysis about Rashee Rice this week. And the entire plan was to come back to Rashee Rice on Saturday and talk about him more in this video. But now I can't list him as a nuke or a landmine because maybe not the people in our community, but those that come and go at times are gonna think I'm just hedging my bet. That, oh, he listed him as a sit in the video, but now everybody got upset about it, so he's gonna turn around now and say, no, you're gonna start him because he's gonna go nuclear. Or you're just gonna chastise me because you're gonna say, dude, you don't get it. Why are you sitting Rashee Rice? Even though I never directly said to sit Rashee Rice. So let's just talk about him a little bit more. He's not going to be a nuke or a landmine in this video. I'm going to let you all make that decision. But let me bring up a couple of points that I saw people making in the comments. That's what we're going to do with this section of the video. The number one comment that popped up about Rashee Rice on the start and sit video was, we can't afford to sit him. We've been waiting for him to come back. We've been dealing with injuries and buys. And while I somewhat get that, you have to remember that I make a video for over 100,000 people to watch every single week. I can't predict what you can and can't do with every single one of your teams. Yes, there are going to be some of you out there that can't sit Rashee Rice. So why would you? Just because I had him listed as a sit because I said personally I want to take a week to see how he integrates back into this offense with all these wide receivers playing so well, that doesn't mean that you need to. And like some of those comments said, you might not be able to afford to sit him. So don't. The good news is no, we're not dealing with a lot of buys this week, so it may not be an emergency due to bye weeks. Keon Coleman, Khalil Shakir, and Zay Flowers are the top 3 wide receivers missing this week. I highly doubt any of your teams are worse off because of them being on a bye. Now, if your main argument is injuries, then that makes a ton of sense because there are a ton of guys missing this week. Marvin Harrison Jr. is dealing with a concussion. Garrett Wilson, Puka Nacua, CeeDee Lamb has not been confirmed as of this recording is playing yet this week. So if you own any of those guys and you have Rashee Rice on your bench, I guarantee that he's a better option than a majority of guys that you could pick up off waivers. So yes, you would play Rashee Rice then. But keep in mind what I actually said in the video and not what was put on the graphic. If Rashee Rice plays approximately 80% of the snaps this week, then I said that he absolutely moved to a fringe start and Hollywood Brown would move away from that. But if for some reason that Rashee Rice were to play significantly less than 80% of the snaps, let's say less than 70%, he's gonna have trouble making up all of those points that you're probably hoping for. Because I guarantee a bunch of you right now watching this video are starting Rashee Rice and you're hoping for him to go nuclear. But with how good Hollywood Brown is playing, 2 touchdowns last week, Xavier Worthy, he's looked pretty solid since returning. Travis Kelce's been very good so far this season. You still have Tyquan Thornton and you still have Juju Smith-Schuster. Now, are Thornton and Juju going to be fantasy options over Rashee Rice? No, But if they play more snaps over Rashee Rice than what we would like, then that's just going to take away opportunities from Rice. I could absolutely see something happening this week where Worthy and Hollywood Brown play the most snaps out of the wide receivers, and then Rashee Rice would come in at number 3. But what is that number going to look like at number 3? Is it going to be 70, 75, 80% of the snaps? Or is it going to be less than that? And that's why I have concerns. So am I going to list him as nuclear or landmine? No, I'm not. I'm going to let you make that decision this week, and I'm going to let you decide what's going to be best for your lineup. I've shared my concerns with you, and I've shared my analysis with you. If you have a strong team where you could wait a week on Rashee Rice, then maybe that's what's going to be best for your team. But if you're dealing with a ton of injuries and you don't have better options, then of course you're playing Rashee Rice. Go with your gut at that point. Who cares what the graphic says? It's your team. I'm just trying to share my thoughts, my opinions, and my concerns with you all. And hopefully, as we move forward throughout the season, those won't be concerns because Rashee Rice will end up being just fine. Okay, I spent way longer talking about Rashee Rice than what I wanted to, so let's start hopping into some other players. So those of you that don't have Rashee Rice and don't care about him, can start looking at some of these guys. And we're going to start with Brian Thomas Jr. from Jacksonville. Right now going up against the LA Rams. This is not a matchup that I'm loving over in England. Now, for Brian Thomas Jr., he's tied for 9th among wide receivers in targets. So he's seeing a fair amount of volume coming his way. And last week, he was finally able to turn those targets into fantasy production. And you can see on this matchup with the LA Rams that he doesn't have a great ceiling for a couple of different factors. When you take a look at the numbers, now the Rams are currently allowing the 11th fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers. A couple of different reasons for that. Number one, only 4 receiving touchdowns. That obviously keeps the ceiling low every single week. But when you take a look at the yards allowed, they're significantly less than the receptions. The Rams are allowing the 8th most receptions to opposing wide receivers, but they're only ranked 17th in terms of receiving yards, meaning even though they're giving up a fair amount of receptions, they're limiting big plays, which limits Brian Thomas Jr.'s upside. So this week, even though he's coming off of a very solid week, I think he's more of a landmine than an opportunity to go nuclear because his ceiling could be held in check by the Rams. This matchup on paper for Alvin Kamara going up against the Chicago Bears looks really, really good. But I decided to dive a little bit deeper because there was something that I found very interesting. Right now, this Bears defense is allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game and the 7th most rushing yards to opposing running backs. But one thing that I found when I looked at the individual performances was the studs, they were studs. But the other guys that aren't really studs, they were okay at best. For instance, back in week 2, Jahmyr Gibbs ran for 94 yards on 12 carries and added a touchdown. David Montgomery, he ran for 57 yards on 11 carries and also added a touchdown. 2 top running back options, again a good offense, they did well at home, surprising, right? But then Ashton Jeanty had a huge performance against Chicago as well. He ran for 138 yards on 21 carries, added a touchdown on the ground, but also added 2 receiving touchdowns as well. Those 3 players right there make up a majority of the big fantasy points that have been given up by Chicago so far this season. It's the rest of the performances where nobody really reached a ceiling. Back in week 1, Jordan Mason ran for 68 yards on 15 carries. Aaron Jones, he was okay, but it was through the air, 44 receiving yards on 3 catches and 1 touchdown. Okay floors, not great ceilings. After that, Javonte Williams, he ran for 76 yards on 10 carries. Solid efficiency, no ceiling. JCM, he ran for 61 yards on 17 carries. Decent efficiency, but no ceiling. And I'm sorry, but Alvin Kamara is way closer to these other guys performance-wise than anything that Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery, or even Ashton Jeanty ended up doing. So for me this week, I think a lot of people look at the matchup and get super excited about it. But I think Alvin Kamara may end up being a landmine instead. Let's dive into DeAndre Swift going up against the New Orleans Saints this week a little bit more in depth. Fantasy owners were ecstatic with the performance he gave you on Monday Night Football. And of course, it's led a lot of people out there to be like, oh man, DeAndre Swift, he's got that ceiling again, here he comes. Totally get that thought process. But was his performance on Monday Night Football something that we're going to see consistently, or was it a little bit more luck than anything? And listen, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, so I'm all for it. But going up against New Orleans, right now their defense is allowing the 12th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. And also, they're currently ranked 17th in the league, having only allowed 512 rushing yards. They've also only allowed 5 total touchdowns to opposing running backs. So the yards aren't super high. The total touchdowns aren't super high either. And last week, in his performance on Monday Night Football, DeAndre Swift scored 11.5 fantasy points on only one play. It was that 55-yard touchdown reception in the third quarter. The rest of the game, if you take that away, he would have only scored 13 fantasy points. So really, it's one play that made his day. And that happens in fantasy football sometimes. And I'm not trying to take that away from DeAndre Swift. I'm just trying to help you all understand that it wasn't like it was a consistently huge performance that maybe indicates some bigger things coming. It was a broken play where he got loose, got a touchdown on a receiving play out of the backfield, and scored almost half of his fantasy points on just that play alone. Now, had he not had that play and he only scored 13 fantasy points, he would have been way more in line with what he's done so far this season, which would have been outside the top 12. So if those of you playing DeAndre Swift feel like he's going to be a top 12 running back moving forward, I would be hesitant to just go ahead and put that stamp on him as of right now. Let's see what he does against New Orleans. But for me, because of the thought process around DeAndre Swift, he's more of a landmine player than a nuclear player. I'm going to touch on Harold Fannin Jr. super quick because I listed him as a fringe start because I wasn't 100% sure yet when the tight end video came out whether or not David Njoku was going to end up playing. And since that video came out, David Njoku has not practiced. And Kevin Stefanski says Njoku's knee injury is truly day to day, and he's going to be questionable heading into his matchup this week. Now, by the time this video comes out, that could end up changing. Njoku could be absolutely out, or he could end up being in. Regardless of what that is, though, I expect him to be limited even if he can play this week. And because of that, Harold Fannin Jr. for me in this matchup, going up against Miami, who has allowed the 8th most fantasy points per game and the 3rd most receiving yards to opposing tight ends, Fannin is going to be a nuclear option this week at the tight end position. A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith have an awful matchup going up against the Minnesota Vikings secondary. They're currently allowing only 18 fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Devontae Smith so far this season has not finished as a wide receiver 1 in any week, and he only has 2 wide receiver 2 performances. A.J. Brown, he has 1 wide receiver 1 performance and only 1 wide receiver 2 performance. And Minnesota is allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Minnesota also has not allowed more than 200 passing yards in a game yet this year. A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith, they have a high ceiling every single week because of their big playability, but they are absolutely landmine players in a matchup like this with how this offense has played so far this season. But sticking inside that same game, I'm going to list Jordan Addison as a nuclear type player this week because I like what I've seen from him so far since he returned. Now, it's only a wide receiver 20 performance in back-to-back weeks, but he had a touchdown. He's also had over 100 receiving yards in his return as well. And so far, him and Justin Jefferson are getting a lot of volume and they're playing well together. Now, when you take a look at the fantasy points per game, Philadelphia does not allow a ton of fantasy points. It's because they've only allowed 4 receiving touchdowns so far this season, but they have allowed the 9th most receiving yards. And because of that, I think Jordan Addison could absolutely have a big day in terms of just the receiving yards alone. Does he find the end zone? Maybe not, but if he doesn't and he still goes over 100 yards, throwing the football this week against Philadelphia, that could end up being a solid option for Minnesota to offset the run game. I already know people are going to hate this Cam Skattebo take. You're going to tell me how disrespectful I am to him, that I hate him, that he's been such a good running back. And just like you're entitled to your opinion in the comment section, I'm entitled to my analysis. Here's the thing about Cam Skattebo this week, going up against Denver, who currently allows the 4th fewest fantasy points per game this season, and only 1 rushing touchdown, I think a lot of you are getting a little bit too excited about 3 rushing touchdowns against a defense last week that has had trouble stopping the run all season long. But it's not just the fantasy points, it's the rushing yards too, because Denver also allows the 12th fewest rushing yards to opposing running backs. Denver's defense is really good, and I highly doubt Cam Skattebo is going to score 3 touchdowns again this week. It just depends on if New York can move the ball enough to get into the red zone for Skattebo to score touchdowns. Could he end up having an okay amount of yards? Yeah, but if he can't find the end zone, or maybe he only finds the end zone once and runs for 40 or 50 yards, that's not a ton of upside that y'all are expecting. For me this week, Cam Skattebo, he's got to be a landmine player. The matchup is awful. All right, I got a few nuclear players that I want to touch on really quick. The first one is going to be Jameson Williams. Now, with Williams being a nuclear option this week against Tampa Bay, part of it is kind of a gut feeling. Why? Well, the last time Detroit lost on the road back in week 1, they came back home and they put up 52 points on the Chicago Bears. And in that game, Williams didn't have a ton of volume, but he did catch 2 of 4 targets for over 100 receiving yards and a touchdown. And based on how he played last week, I think he could have a solid week once again. Seattle's defense is very good, so I'm going to give them their props for that. But I think CJ Stroud has an opportunity to be nuclear this week. First and foremost, Seattle's defense going up against opposing quarterbacks about middle of the road so far this season when it comes to fantasy points per game. And one of the reasons they've been able to suppress fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, they have 7 interceptions on the season. So there is going to be an opportunity for CJ Stroud to throw a pick or 2 in this game. We're going to keep our fingers crossed that that does not happen. But they do allow the 4th most passing yards. And more than likely, I believe this game will be more of a neutral game script opportunity for CJ Stroud, where he'll be able to throw the football. Now, going up against Seattle, he's had the bye week to prepare, and over his last 2 games going into the bye week, he's thrown 6 touchdowns and 0 interceptions. So he's playing good football right now, had an extra week to prepare for Seattle, and this is a Seattle defense that gives up a decent amount of passing yards. I like CJ Stroud this week. I've had a lot of questions about Jordan Love going up against the Arizona Cardinals, and I'll tell you right now, I love his floor this week, and I know this video is primarily meant to talk more about ceilings of players, but I love Jordan Love's floor and where he could be at the end of the week based on that alone, but I think he does offer some upside potential as well. When you take a look at the Arizona Cardinals, they allow the 10th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Part of the reason why is quarterbacks, they only have 7 passing touchdowns so far against Arizona, and Arizona is barely allowing any rushing yards. They've allowed the 6th fewest rushing yards to opposing quarterbacks. So there's not a ton of fantasy points building up against them in those 2 areas, but the one area that Jordan Love could be successful this week, passing yards, because Arizona allows the 5th most passing yards. So I decided to go take a look at the quarterbacks against Arizona so far this season and how they have done. Spencer Rattler, he threw for 214 yards, no touchdowns, but no interceptions as well. Bryce Young, he had a great ceiling, 328 yards, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception. Mac Jones, 284 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Sam Darnold, he had 242 yards, 1 touchdown, no interceptions. Even Cam Ward threw for 265 yards against this defense. And Daniel Jones, 212 yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 1 interception. So as you've seen, so far quarterbacks this season have had a solid floor going up against this team. Jordan Love has that solid floor once again. But I also think he has the potential to have one of those performances that leave him inside the top 12 by the end of the week. Okay, I don't have a ton of definitive research to back up the fact I think Evan Ingram could go nuclear this week, but who doesn't love a good revenge matchup against your former team? Evan Ingram has at least 6 targets in each of the last 2 games. That is trending in the right direction. He hasn't done a ton with those targets as of yet, but I could see this being a game where typically wide receivers, they're easier going up against the New York Giants than what, tight ends are. But Evan Ingram going up against his former team, knowing that he could end up being the number 2 option to Courtland Sutton here very soon, I think Evan Ingram's got a nice ceiling this week. I am scared to death to start Wan'Dale Robinson this week, and I know a lot of you probably will have to, just like we talked about with Rashee Rice. Oh man, that ceiling could be very, very low though. We know this Denver team can shut down wide receivers, and Wan'Dale Robinson isn't even considered a top tier wide receiver. He's good, don't get me wrong, but they're shutting down guys like Garrett Wilson with no problem whatsoever. Wan'Dale Robinson, the Denver Broncos allow the second fewest fantasy points per game, the 8th fewest receiving yards, and they've only allowed 1 receiving touchdown so far this season. Wan'Dale Robinson is a landmine for me. And since we started the show with the Kansas City Chief, let's end the show with the Kansas City Chief. Travis Kelce, I think, is a landmine option this week. Going up against Las Vegas, they currently allow the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends because they've only allowed 2 receiving touchdowns so far. And when you look at what tight ends have done against them, there are some pretty good tight ends that have okay performances. Tyler Warren, he had 4 catches on 4 targets for 44 yards and a touchdown. Not bad. If you got that from Travis Kelce, you would like that. But then like Zach Ertz only had 38 yards on 3 catches. Hunter Henry had 68 yards on 4 catches. Rice is back. Hollywood Brown had 2 touchdowns last week. And like I mentioned at the top of the show, there's a lot of options for Patrick Mahomes to discuss. Rashee Rice being back, though, could be the option that really ends up killing the targets that Travis Kelce's been getting so far this season. Does Patrick Mahomes stop looking at him? Probably not. But until we see exactly how this will shake out in terms of targets, Travis Kelce is a landmine for me. Headliner Nation, I appreciate you all checking out this video, but more importantly, I appreciate the fact that you all allow me the opportunity to do this every single week. Hopefully my communication about Rashee Rice was a lot better in this video than my start and sit video, because based on the comments, either A, I didn't do a good enough job of communicating my thoughts to you, or B, people just read the graphic and didn't listen, which happens from time to time, but it is what it is. Headliner Nation, I've got one simple request. Let your boy cook. I feel like I'm really good at what I do. Sometimes I might leave some food in the pan just a little bit too long. Or I'll slice myself open like I did the other day, and I'm gonna need to glue it shut, and I'm gonna need to limp throughout the rest of the meal. But here's the thing. More times than not, when you sit down to my table, I am going to provide a delectant meal that you will want to keep coming back to time and time again, because the experience you get a majority of the time is well worth it. Headliner Nation, appreciate y'all and appreciate you letting me do this on a weekly basis. Stay safe and stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.
Analytics off the chain.